Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to this webinar on creative places, creative tourism in small communities. The webinar is hosted today by the Tourism Group and the School of Management at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. My name is Karen Smith. I'm Professor of Tourism Management at the University, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. I'd like to welcome our audience. We've got international participants and also New Zealand-based participants. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge my New Zealand colleagues who are currently in lockdown. I know for us that's a little bit unusual, and internationally people have been in different spaces, but both ourselves and I'd particularly like to acknowledge our Auckland and Northland attendees who are facing a longer lockdown. I'd also, before we get going, like to acknowledge and thank our behind the scenes team. So we have Associate Professor Ian Yeoman, who is our series, a seminar series organizer, and also Louise Grimside from the School of Management, who's providing organizational and tech support. So today's seminar is around creative places. It was the American urban studies professor Richard Florida who popularized the term creative classes and considered what this means for urban regeneration, and including that, what destinations need to do to attract the creative tourist. Some of the concepts we hear are authenticity, new experiences, festivals and events, looking at collaboration and cultural identity. On the slide there, you should be able to see a quote from one of our speakers today, Professor Kathleen Scherf's recent book, Creative Tourism in Small Communities, where she talks about smaller communities have a unique opportunity to develop creative and culturally sustainable tourism industries that provide unparalleled experiences for visitors. Today, we've asked our three speakers to consider this and to think about a post-COVID-19 world, local, smaller and small sustainable communities, and think about what is the role of creativity in these places. So today we have three thought-provoking speakers ahead: Kathleen Scherf, John Allen, and Leon Gurovich. They're going to explore different aspects of small communities, technologies, and destination management. Now, each speaker has about 10 minutes to speak. We also have the question and answer function open on the webinar. So this means you can ask questions at any time and our speakers will be able to see them. You'll also be able to upvote the questions that come through. So when we get to the end, and I'll pose all of the questions at the end of the webinar, I'll be able to select some of those that a number of people would like to be asked. I'll just remind my fellow speakers that to put themselves on mute when they're not speaking, and also remind everybody we are recording this webinar, and that'll be shared with all of our participants and attendees, including those who are registered and aren't joining us live, in probably the next sort of 7 to 10 days. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Kathleen Scherf. She's Professor of Communications at Thompson Rivers University in British Columbia and joins us today from Canada. Her topic is Small is the New Big, and it particularly draws on the latest edited book, Creative Tourism in Smaller Communities, Place, Culture and Local Representation, published earlier this year by the University of Calgary Press. Now, I'll just remind our speakers that I'm in control of the slides, so you'll hear them say next slide when they'd like us to move on. So first of all, welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you so much to everyone at Victoria University of Wellington for asking me to participate, and heart goes out to everyone in New Zealand in lockdown, and welcome to our international audience. I think my first slide is slide 5, so we can go to that. Now, when we started this book, which was, as Karen said, published in April 2021, it was before we'd ever heard of COVID. So this idea of focusing on creative tourism in smaller places happened before COVID, but the pandemic definitely sharpened the focus on small tourism in small places. And I kind of think of creative tourism as the marriage of cultural and experiential tourism. So the kind of the cultural assets of a particular destination are refined, and then through experiential opportunity shared in a participatory manner with visitors. So we know from the work of Greg Richards that creative tourism talks about the transfer of culture-based and endogenous knowledge to the visitor and the experiential participation. Richards talked a lot about collaborative paradigm in terms of establishing a relationship between the visitor and the resident. But I think that our studies in the first book really focused on collaborative paradigms, not just between the visitor and the resident, but amongst residents and bodies within the residents. And of course, we were interested in sustainable tourism development, but what comes through in creative tourism, at least in the studies in this book that we're talking about, was a more conscious view, longer view toward the sustainability, not just of that tourism enterprise, but a view toward cultural sustainability of the host community. And we'll move to slide 6 now, please. Now, this idea of creativity and creative communities, creative classes, as we've already talked about, was kind of sparked by Richard Florida's work in the early 90s. But I think that even Florida himself, about a decade later, and many other commentators have talked about how in smaller communities, Florida's ideas about the creative community are less useful because he relies so much on the idea of an infrastructure, an urban infrastructure, to draw the creative classes. And of course, we know that tourism occurs not just in huge cities. In fact, in the book, we look at small rural communities in Portugal, EU cities that are smaller than 250,000, rural festivals and events in South Africa. We particularly look at, and this is, I guess, part of being Canadian, is peripheral communities in the Yukon, in the Canadian Arctic, in Iceland, and in Scandinavia. And there are particular issues around remote peripheral communities. We look at small communities and how they can benefit from, say, food tourism or film and television tourism. And we look, and this will interest Leon, I think, in particular, we look at Wales, which is a smaller community than its neighbor, Great Britain, but we look at small communities there that are that have been opened up to tourists via a web platform called the Literary Heritage of Wales. And one thing I'd like to bring up is the idea of neighborhoods, and I think probably John Allen will talk about this more. He's the next speaker. People, it's hard to have that real connection between the everyday life of a community that Greg Richards talks about and the visitor when you're faced with, say, Barcelona. How can you really engage in a place as huge as Barcelona? My own work has focused on the El Raval neighborhood of Barcelona, which is a highly international one and is kind of on the west side of Las Ramblas, with on the east side the Gótico neighborhood, which is now not even a neighborhood, it's really a Disneyland of Barcelona. But Barcelona realizes that it has a problem with the many tourists that go there on cruise ships, for example, being debauched into the two neighborhoods that make up the kind of central area of Barcelona. There's just not enough infrastructure. Residents in El Raval are peeved, to say the least, with all the tourists. So I think that larger urban communities are getting the idea of neighborhoods. Copenhagen, wonderful Copenhagen, their tourism destination organization has declared the end of tourism as we know it. And it welcomes the idea of localhood. And unlike Barcelona, it provides technologies for visitors to visit the smaller neighborhoods within Copenhagen. Amsterdam is also taking part in this, as is Montreal. So I just want to bring up the idea of tourism in smaller places, not just being small communities or remote peripheral communities, but I'd like to bring up the possibility of neighborhoods within larger urban settings. Another thing we noted that's kind of maybe newish to a discussion of tourism in smaller communities is the importance of community-led or culture-led planning to identify cultural assets and bring residents together in making tourism experiences, and thus being able to actually have a relationship with visitors. We'll move to slide 7 now, please. The book,
Apologies, that was me going far too fast.
yeah.
And it's left, Kathleen. I'll go to the next one.
Slide 5, so we will go past slide 6 and on to slide 7. And in the book, I think there are 14 chapters maybe, we see, and I won't read them out loud because everybody who's on this webinar can no doubt read, that we discovered or pulled out of the chapters 5 conditions that enable more successful creative place-based tourism in smaller communities. These are not necessarily necessary or sufficient conditions, but the more of them that are there, the more sustainable and successful tourism, creative tourism will be in smaller communities. We can move to slide 8, please. Now, of course, the main thrust of creative tourism responds to the trend, the want, the need for authentically engaged everyday life experiences in the host destination. And what we realized is that, of course, it's much easier to have an everyday life experience if we have a manageable size of place or a manageable home, a manageable community, a manageable host community. And Corona has, of course, that pandemic has emphasized the need for small tourism in small places. In Canada, I live in beautiful British Columbia, and all summer we were advised to stay local, to vacation local. We'll go to my final slide, please. Now, a new book is coming out. In fact, and others on this webinar have chapters due tomorrow, the day after tomorrow here in Canada. And so I hope to have the manuscript to U of C Press by spring 2022, which will be publication in spring 2023. And that's that book will be called Small Tourism in Small Places, and there'll be a colon as usual, and some sort of really sexy, innovative tagline that I have yet to think of. So in the first book, we could see that we saw a collaborative turn in creative tourism. So ideas of collaboration, not just between visitors and residents, but by networks offering the tourism experience. Of course, there's an artistic trend. In many communities, the local arts and crafts are the best way that that tourists can engage with the cultural assets of the place. But I think as a result of COVID, we've seen a third turn, and that's really about small tourism experiences. And by small tourism, I mean not just urban neighborhoods in Slovenia, Colombia, and Portugal. We'll also be looking at the role of creatives in semi-wild areas. We're going to look at altruistic providers in your part of the world, in Southwest Australia, the regeneration of Fitzsterling National Park. We're going to look at altruism in an Italian small community and in some Indigenous communities. And then the last section of the book and the last bit of comment I have is that we're going to look at some ideas for developing tourism enterprises. We're going to look at in migrants putting on creative tourism experiences in Japan. We're going to look at the need to address gay tourism visitors in British Columbia, which in many ways can still be very conservative. And then Ian and his partner Una, his academic partner Una, will be looking at ecotourism in small places. And that's what we'll be doing in the next book. Thank you.
Kia, thank you, Kathleen. A really nice taster, but I also love you've used it to remind your co-author, your authors to get their chapters in. It's thank you very much.
Some of them are on this webinar. Yes. Really
interesting to hear how the new book is going to be building on some of those initial ideas. Now we have got our first question popped up there, and so if you do have questions for any of our panelists, please do pop them in the Q&A and we'll pull together those at the end of the session. I'd like to now turn to our second speaker, John Allen, who's the Chief Executive of Wellington NZ, our regional economic development agency. John's been in the role since, I think, mid last year, but is an experienced Chief Executive, including New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's also served on the board of a number of cultural organisations, including Te Papa and the New Zealand Festival, and he's currently on the Council of Victoria University of Wellington as well. So, John, with your many, many different hats, it's really good to have you here. John doesn't have slides, so I'm just going to leave this first one up, and I'll let you know when we've had 10 minutes, John. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. Can I first say to Kathleen, thank you for that presentation, and buy the book. The book's available at Unity. I've bought a copy, and it's good reading, and the examples in it are fantastic. So get out there and buy the book, and it sounds as though it's on a series. There's going to be a whole lot of other books coming after it, so we'll be buying up for a while, which is great. I thought the way in which I'd approach this, because I'm not an academic, I'm more of a practitioner in the tourism space, and even then only just a learner against all the experience on this webinar, is to approach it through 3 dates and about 3 or 4 examples. I might get to 5 examples if I get really fired up. But the context, I think, is first to think about this place, this country of New Zealand, which in my view has always positioned itself as small and remote. I know that irritates some people, but David Lange, one of our prime ministers, once described us as shaped like a dagger, strategically positioned, thrusting at the heart of Antarctica. by which I think he meant we were largely irrelevant on the world stage. The three dates that I want to use is first 1870. And I want to use 1870 because it was in 1870 that Prince Alfred, the then Duke of Edinburgh, arrived to visit New Zealand as an early tourist. In fact, characteristic of the early tourists, he was wealthy. He was, he had all of the affluence that's now regarded as being a high value tourist. And he visited the Pink and White Terraces with the Arawa people of Rotorua and was blown away not only by the place and the geographical magnificence of those particular features, now sadly destroyed, but also by the enterprise of Te Arawa people, the way in which they were promoting this particular feature, the way in which they hosted, the way in which they guided him through his visit. And it's interesting that what he was looking for was to understand this place, to understand its history, and particularly to understand Māoridom, and to get as far away as he possibly could from England in that context. In fact, another visitor at about that time, Anthony Trollope, the famous English writer, having come across the oceans and landed at Bluff, made the observation that it was very disappointing to him, this was his initial observation, that having come this far, he didn't seem to have got away at all from England. So even then, people were wanting different experience. They were wanting authentic experience, to use Kathleen's language, and they were wanting to be able to engage in a real way with the people of our place. The second date that I'd use then is to move forward to 1965, and I'm only using that as a sort of way placeholder. At the time that Prince Alfred arrived, we were having about 5,000 tourists a year. In the first recorded dates, we were doing about 5,233, I think was in 1903. By about 1965, that number had got up to about 70,000, obviously ships and transport and all kinds of reasons for that. By 2019, my third date, by 2019, tourism, as most of on this call probably know, was at 3.9 million visitors. And as Kathleen has said, it was putting enormous pressure on infrastructure, on community, on environment, and was simply not sustainable. The opportunity, the license to operate for tourism businesses was under real threat in this country and in other places around the world. And so the small tourism message that Kathleen's just represented is a necessary riposte and a necessary repositioning, obviously brought into even sharper relief by COVID. So now my examples. I thought I'd start actually in a very small town. I thought I'd start in Featherston. That might be in the next book, I'm not sure, but the New Zealand contributors might be looking at Featherston. Featherston's a tiny wee town, about an hour's drive out of Wellington. It was largely bypassed by effectively anything until about the early 2000s. And there was very little in the way of development. It's now a hotbed of artistic endeavour. It's now a book town. And it's positioned itself through that mechanism as being a place to live, a place to work, a place to play. And it's been a remarkable transformation. It's attracted all kinds of artists. People like Joy Cowley live there, Sam Ducker-Jones, one of our young poets, who described it, in fact, as now, he described the contemporary Featherston experience as being a frontier town with a fromagerie. Which I thought was a terrific explanation of Featherston. But what happened in Featherston was really interesting, because what happened was a group of residents got together with a clear long-term vision for the city, or for the community. And they and their passion drove this establishment of Booktown. They engaged the community around it. They created a festival out of that engagement, which now attracts hundreds of people to Featherston, has spawned a whole accommodation industry in Featherston, has made Featherston a centre of debate and discussion and artistic endeavour that it would never have thought were possible. And unfortunately, as a consequence, has driven up the prices of Featherston property, which I suspect is driving out the very artists that are necessary to sustain that particular model. To Wellington City for a second example. And of course, those of you on the call from New Zealand will remember that there were times when Wellington wasn't the creative heartbeat of the nation, when it wasn't seen as the most dynamic, diverse, tolerant, engaged, and exciting place in our country. I know many of you won't be able to remember those times, but they do exist, and they were in about the 70s and 80s. We were thought to be grey, bureaucratic, unbelievably boring, and basically a place that you would avoid at all costs. So what changed? Well, I want to talk about just two things that happened at that time, two examples. One is the establishment of Zealandia. So as many of you will know, Zealandia was the first eco-sanctuary created in an urban centre. It's surrounded by about 8.3 kilometres of predator-proof fencing, and that has enabled a 500-year vision to re-establish the biodiversity of our community, right in the heart of the capital city of our country. It's a startling and dynamic vision. It's extraordinary technology that's enabled the predator proofing. But what they've then been able to do is bring bird life, 18 species that weren't seen in the capital, back into the capital. And then they've bred in this enclosed environment, and out they go. So we've got masses of birds. We've got bird song. We've got birds we've never seen before because of this engagement. And what's exciting about that, the reason that I think it fits neatly into Kathleen's description, is because that vision was brought to life by volunteers. So they use volunteer labour, hundreds of volunteers. They have thousands of members from our community who are engaged actively in the work of that and the delivery of the vision of that particular experience. They attracted 143,000 visitors in the 2020 year, and that was disrupted by COVID, so that's a pretty remarkable thing. And they are linked to a series of universities and academic studies, so there's real knowledge sharing going on, both with the visitor through curated visits and and people guiding them through the experience, but also in their own understanding and research. So it's a great example, I think, of an opportunity out of the CBD in the suburbs, but which is very directly engaging visitors, inspiring visitors, educating visitors in a unique and different way. Now, I'll just use one more because I suspect I'm getting to the end of my my three.
You've still got a minute or so.
Minute or so. All right, very brief on this one. So I thought Weta. Now I know I've got Wellington on a plate up there, and I could do that if I get time. But Weta is a good one. So Weta, I think, is a brand most people around the world will know. It's a screen phenomenon created by Peter Jackson, responsible for Lord of the Rings, which has taken New Zealand to the international community in a remarkable way. I want to talk about Weta Cave. And Weta Cave is a tiny little shop, really, way out in Miramar Peninsula, which is in a suburban part of Wellington, established by Richard Taylor and his wife in their Weta workshop business. And what that does is, predictably, sell little bits and pieces of iconography from Weta movies. But the thing that I think makes it interesting is not that every visitor goes there because of that, but because they also offer engaged, interactive opportunity for tourists and visitors to learn the traditional arts of model making that Richard's built his whole career on, of costuming, including chainmail making, which has been a key. If you look at the movies they make, chainmail's a big part of it. So there's a real interactive opportunity in that experience. And again, it's all driven by a long-term vision that the artistry of those basic creative techniques and capabilities needs to be preserved, and people need to understand those skills and need to engage with those skills if they're going to be preserved. So again, it's driven by a long-term vision. It's anchored in deep understanding and creativity. It's authentic to place, and it is creating opportunity for a sustainable tourism operation. Now, there's heaps of other opportunities, but what I would say to you is that those are the features that I wanted to draw out from the examples to suggest to you what the elements of a successful, small, focused, authentic tourist experience might be. And in my view, that is the direction in which tourism in Aotearoa, New Zealand is going to proceed. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, John. Really fascinating examples. And one of our first questions was actually about, is small tourism only about rural communities? And I think you've illustrated very well, it's not. There is question and answers open. We've got some questions lined up for later. But first, let's go to our third and final speaker, Associate Professor Leon Gerovich. Leon is based in the Wellington School of Architecture here at Victoria University of Wellington, and is also the Associate Dean Research and Innovation for that faculty. He's going to be talking to us today about creative cities and creative technologies. Kia ora, welcome, Leon.
Kia ora, thanks for having me. And I just want to say what a fantastic, both of the previous talks have had multiple points in both of them that I've thought, oh, there's connections here. So hopefully we'll be able to start to see the connections across all of them. So can we just jump to the next slide? In the spirit of kind of classic, I've only got 10 minutes to talk. I'm going to talk far faster than I probably rightly should. And I'm probably not going to get through everything anyway. And also in the spirit of that kind of thing, I have more questions on this slide than I could possibly hope to answer, usually in, answers on a postcard the length of a PhD, please. The images here of these utopian cities, I put them in not because I'm keen on this kind of thing, but more because actually they generally tend to make me laugh, because these utopian cities that we imagine as being fantastic new places for communities to live and be and thrive. I often find the reality of cities and the reality of lived experience and the everyday is always, for me, both more mundane when it really comes down to it, and more exciting because of the mundaneness. And I kind of want to talk about the relationship between the mundane and creativity, or the mundane and innovation, because I actually think the processes of creativity and processes of innovation weirdly are more mundane than we usually give ourselves, we give credit for, basically. Because I'm talking about creative cities and creative technologies, the first thing I want us to say is, are cities creative and are technologies creative? And as you'll see on the next slide in a minute, I really, what I want to say is no. I want to avoid technological determinism. I hate the technological determinism that somehow wants to personify cities or technologies and say it's people that are creative, and it's how are those people organized, and in what relationship to each other are those people organized, and how does that spark creativity? So the first thing I would say is, are they creative? No. Can cities and technologies help to accelerate creativity, though? Can they help to foster it? And I would say absolutely yes. And what we need to do is understand something about what creativity is and what is the process of creativity and innovation, in order to understand how communities and technologies can either accelerate it, or, as everybody's, I think people are starting to work out pretty quickly about Airbnb, they can hinder it as well. That certain seemingly disruptive innovations can end up being very harmful for community and creativity in the long term. And we'll jump to the next slide. So the first thing I want to say about creativity and innovation, I'm going to look in the most unusual of places. I'm going to go for the Quarterly Journal of Economics. This was a fantastic article from 1998. I come back to this over and over again, in which Martin Wiseman, he said, what is innovation? He basically tries to quantify it in a mathematical way. He says, what is innovation? And the fascinating argument he comes up with is, innovation is not and by extension, creativity a lot of the time is not a eureka moment. It's not an I've got it. It's not Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. He had groups of 20 or 30 people working in Menlo Park, testing thousands of different possible combinations to come up with a light bulb. And he was one of 28 other people who invented the light bulb at the same time. So innovation is not a eureka moment. It's according to Wiseman, it's what's called recombinant. He talks about recombinant growth. And that is old ideas being put together in new ways. He says almost all innovation is old ideas being put together in new ways. And there are other theorists who write about this as well. Matt Ridley, I'm not a big fan of Matt Ridley, but Matt Ridley does talk about, he says, innovation is basically slow and iterative. It's a trial and error process, basically. One thing Ridley does say that I think is interesting is he says cities can tend to be creative innovation engines, that cities are often the origin and the location of a lot of creativity. And if we look at why that is, it's really because cities are, and have been for a very long time, especially pre-internet, a place where dense networks could grow. Dense networks of people, dense networks of ideas, dense networks of skills and sharing of skills. And so what we know is to hit you with a really broad kind of a broad claim, which is that networks can improve opportunities for recombinance, and therefore networks can often improve opportunities for creative innovation. And of course, the case of Featherstone was just an example of that. When John Allen brought up Featherstone, I also actually thought about Berlin. Berlin's a classic example in which artists were shipped to Berlin, and Berlin became a powerfully creative hub, basically. And this was because the more networks of artists sharing ideas, the more chances for those artists to then start recombining each other's ideas and start to come up with more ideas. So what I would say is cities are or can be nodal points for creative tourism, whether or not they are a small community or not. But the next question the next point I'd like to make is the question of small communities, I think, and both Kathleen and John touched on this. I think you can have small communities in large cities as well, right? You can have big, dense networks, but small communities within them. And if we can jump to our next slide. And where I really got this sense was a research project I have had for quite a number of years now called the Digital Workshops of the World, in which I was interviewing and studying and modeling the migration pathways of tech industry workers around the world. I fed in about 30,000 and then later 80,000 visual effects industry workers and modeled them moving around the world to see who was coming in and out of New Zealand and what kind of skills were coming in and out, and whether the kind of skills that you have, the kind of capacities you have in the tech industry changes how mobile you are. Because another thing about mobility and migration, and tourism is an important aspect of this, is that mobility and migration often help to foster creative innovation because, again, they help recombinance, they help bring in new ideas. And what I noticed, though, was that even though this was 30 to 80,000 people I was looking at, the networks were actually almost small communities, that people knew each other in London, in Vancouver, in Sydney, in New Zealand, and they were getting each other jobs. And when I was interviewing them, one of the things, this again was Weta Digital, I started to interview people. I was interested in how many people had come to New Zealand from America and Britain and Canada and Australia. How many had come to New Zealand and why? And many of them talked about it was not just a Labour decision. It was actually a holiday decision, that many of them saw 6-month contracts or 1-year contracts and then ended up staying in New Zealand quite often. But they built global networks, but they saw coming to New Zealand for a 6-month or a year-long period as an opportunity for an extended vacation at the same time as they worked. So I think it's important to think in terms of because I think there's a potential post-pandemic for, and of course with climate change issues rising up the agenda very rapidly, for extended workations to be the opposite or the alternative tourism model, in which you are trying to consume as little carbon as possible. And 2 weeks on a plane to get to New Zealand is not one of those ways of consume as little carbon as possible. You want to be there for a year or longer, potentially. And final slide, I think. Oh, no, not the final slide. Well, this was just a thing about, I just wanted to, and I mentioned it earlier, I just wanted to get away from the idea that disruptive innovation and there's a lot of discussion about, creative innovation in the tech industry as if all creative innovation and as if all quote unquote disruptive innovation is good. And this open letter to Airbnb was written very recently, in which it's very, very quickly there is an understanding of the way in which certain forms of networks, certain forms of global networking and global tourist consumption can destroy small communities and are starting to have a hollowing out effect. Although I'm sure Kathleen's actually talked about this in many places, and I'm sure it's something John is grappling with at times. And then to the final slide then, and I just wanted to put one final idea out there. I published an article at the beginning of the year called The Spectacle of Competence, which was about the Ardern government and its response to the global pandemic. What I wanted to say is we are in a radically kind of accelerated moment in our history, in which all sorts of questions are being thrown up about how we do things and how we operate. And one of the things that strikes me every time I think about networks is that we're in this moment where we can physically see the pandemic has accelerated the growth of both biogeographies and also kind of bio networks, in which we are trying to use technologies to try to understand networks of people. I mean, there's nothing better, I think, than a deadly virus for making us aware of all of the network interconnections that we didn't even realize we had until we walk into a cafe and someone else in there has got a transmissible disease. And so I think creative tourism is being altered by changing biogeographies, and I think it will continue. Even if the virus went away tomorrow, I still believe that it would continue to be changed and continue to change, partly because it has accelerated our attitudes to the capacity for change, I think. And I'm going to stop there, and I hope that made sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. And I'd like to thank all three of our speakers for really thought-provoking and really well-connected presentations. I'm just going to stop the share of the slides, and we're going to now turn to questions. We've got 3 questions lined up at the moment. So if you do want to get in with a question, pop it up on the Q&A now. And the first question will go to Professor Jane Bryce, who's Dean of our Wellington School of Business and Government. And her question's been nicely upvoted and links really well into something you touched on right at the end, Leon. But in fact, actually, Jane asked this whilst Kathleen was presenting right at the beginning. And this is, how does small tourism, particularly living like a local, avoid becoming another overexposed corporate venture with unintended consequences, and Airbnb being an example of that? So Kathleen, did you want to start us there?
I can start us. Yes, I mean, it's an excellent question. And in Al Raval, for example, Airbnb is a scourge on the neighborhood. It's terrible. They are absentee landlords. Rents are driven up so high that that the residents can't stay there anymore. And Al Raval has typically been a working class neighborhood throughout throughout history, it's been on the edge. It used to be called, Chinatown. That's where the prostitution business was, the drug business. It's still not great infrastructure in El Raval. And of course, these absentee landlords buy up places, and the residents hate it. They hate that people are bringing their skateboards. And if you've been in El Raval or anywhere downtown Barcelona, the streets are like this wide, and then the buildings go up. And I don't know if you have a skateboarding son, but I sure do. So I know how loud skateboards are. There's all kinds of posters up saying, dear Airbnb people, we hope you're enjoying your vacation, but realize that we live here too. Please pick up your skateboards, and there are noise detectors. I mean, it's really hard to defend absentee Airbnb owners. In my view, however, it's not hard to defend the kind of original idea of Airbnb, of staying with a local and living like a local. I'm not sure how to address that, but I think that if residents are, and we've heard it from both of my colleagues, the other speakers, the necessity for buy-in from local residents in order for live like a local, like Airbnb, to work well. Thank you.
Thank you. Leon or Alan, do you want to jump into this question, or should we move on?
The one thing I would just say is that article, and it's a popular press article, but the article that was on the slide about the open letter to Airbnb, the really interesting thing about that is it does actually suggest a whole load of solutions. It does actually say, here's how you could have a business model that's not destroying communities, that does allow investment, that does allow people to, but also if you want to bring back the original idea, that you can do that by limiting how many days, limiting to 14 days in America a year, that you could do that. And because that's the average length of a vacation for someone, and make sure that they're coming into your house. But if you're wanting to do the investment model, there's clearly a demand for Airbnb style things that replace the hotel industry. And their suggestion is build them with investors, with actual people, Airbnb, the absentee landlords who want to put the money in there. I won't go over the whole detail of it, but what was interesting about that article for me was it was both saying, this is going to become a very profoundly acute social problem very quickly, but also put some suggestions for solutions up in it as well.
Thank you, Leon. So let's jump now to a question from Eliza Raymond. Eliza is one of our PhD students, but also the founder of Good Travel company. And she's asking, does or could creative tourism have a role to play in developing new types of domestic tourism experiences? And use the example of, could migrant communities offer creative tourism experiences to help us travel without leaving home and engage in diversity within our own places? And John, maybe you want to start with that one.
I think the short answer to that is yes. I think there's a huge wealth of experience and knowledge that can be shared from the diverse migrant communities that we have within Aotearoa, New Zealand. And from my point of view, the opportunity to harness that with technology, such as virtual reality type technology that can bring to life in a visual way some of the experiences that might be being narrated, the stories that might be being told by the people who are within our community to us as tourists, if you like, would make that a very powerful proposition. I suppose that does raise a point that I would see us, the locals, being the tourists in that context. And that's an idea that I haven't developed or thought about previously, but I'm sure both of my other speakers have. but that's an interesting idea in terms of what the future of tourism might look like in a post-COVID world. Thank you.
There's another question popped up that actually speaks to that as well, John, from Christy Grant around thoughts around virtual tourism and digital engagement in the absence or with limitations around international travel. And I think you started answering that as well in terms of how that can work as a local, as a tourist. Leon or Kathleen, do you want to pick up either of those questions? Kathleen.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question and an excellent idea. Migrant communities within a place, that's a small community. Certainly, there's a possibility there. And I think, just to go back to something John said, I think when we think about Greg Richards' idea of co-creation of tourism experiences, that the difference between a tourist and a resident can get smaller. Let me share it. So and thank you, John, for pitching my book. But I would also say that, like the University of Calgary Press, I believe in open access. I really think that refereed publications shouldn't have to hide behind a paywall, whether it's virtual or cash, that ideas should be shared. So it's an open access book, so free. I used it to teach my creative tourism class last semester, whatever semesters are now in COVID, it's all mixed up. And here are two ideas that go along with that question. One is, a student had come up with an idea for creative tourism that came up through the Kamloops local beekeeping community, and how that could be a creative tourism experience. He had all kinds of stats about how long hives should be open, when in the year they should be open, the cost of protective equipment, just everything like that. And another idea, we have this killer high-end vintage used clothing store, consignment store here. And I thought, what a great idea it would be if the woman who owns that, like, what if she did once a week for tourists, 2 hours, a 2-hour visit into her back room? Like, how does consignment clothing work? How does that work as a sustainable cultural industry in a community? What are the sustainability benefits? And then everyone could get a $5 gift certificate or something and have shopping time. So I think, yeah, your idea of migrants is one good example, that there are many examples of how small interest communities or ethnic communities or religious communities or food communities could have sustainable small tourism in small places.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to move on to another question now, which is from Professor Chris Rank. You're Chris from the University of Waikato. He's referring back to, I think, Kathleen, you talked about Copenhagen at one point, but thinking about directing tourists into neighbourhoods and the use of smart tourism technologies. But I think he poses an interesting question here. You know, can small rural communities effectively engage in such smart tourism techniques like has been done in Copenhagen? And what support do communities require in the forthcoming world of 5G and other technologies? Leon, did you want to start us on that one? Oh, microphone on, Leon.
Classic, it had to be at some point, right?
You said you were going to do it.
Yeah, I think for me, again, when we're talking about technologies, it's really, I think I think what we need to remember is that the technology facilitates what's already there. I think where technology gets used effectively, So we're talking about, Chris is talking about smart tourism techniques. The technology has to facilitate something that already exists and therefore then wants to be rolled out further, or we then have a requirement for it. I mean, one of the things I'm constantly say to my students is, because I think there's a danger whenever we talk about technology and the use of technology, is that we imagine that what happens is that technology miraculously comes from on high and changes everything. And nobody expected it to be that way. Now, sometimes technologies get implemented and we humans creatively find new ways of deploying that technology that weren't originally intended. But most of the time, technologies are thought of first. They are imagined as something we want, and then we implement them. And of course, you see that all the time in kind of French postcards from 150 years ago of people talking over Zoom, basically using a cinema and a phone. So in terms of how communities can, when you're talking about communities, how do we support communities in the world of 5G? Well, the question for me is, firstly, not just 5G, but the speed of increase of technological implementation is so significant that often we're grappling with today's problems and tomorrow's technology kind of accelerates past that problem. So I'm thinking about, I grew up in a village of 300 people on the west coast of Scotland, and it was pretty cut off. It was radically cut off. And for years and years and years, everyone talked about even having access to television signals. And before you know it, the last time I went there, it was like a different world completely because of the internet. Now, in terms of supporting communities, I think the question quite often is, where is the community and what's the quality of the capacity for infrastructure implementation, and then what do we do about what happens when we do implement that? So, for example, New Zealand rural communities will have come online with internet pretty quickly because New Zealand has the capacity to implement widespread. The question is, do you want it, actually? The question also is, how much do you want 5G? How much do you want internet connectivity? How much do we want Elon Musk giving us internet access while we're hiking on a great walk in New Zealand? Because I know I don't. I mean, I know that one of the selling points in New Zealand, again, it is, if it has been that it is disconnected, we have to think about the question of, for a very, very long time, it was all a question of people having access to the internet and the digital divide. And increasingly seeing people in Silicon Valley, the digital divide is those that can afford to teach their kids in a way that they are explicitly not allowed access to iPads and to networks. For all sorts of reasons. So I think the question is more than just how do we support communities with incoming technologies. It's how do we choose which kind of technologies we want to have. And John's got a question now, I think.
I'm going to give John the last minute, and then we'll need to wrap up. So John, over to you.
Two thoughts on that issue. The first is, if we want people to come on workstations, as has just been described, which I think is a very exciting and interesting idea in a post-COVID world, then the availability of technology that will enable them to link and work back into their wider networks and communities is going to be important. And 5G is probably, whether it actually adds any value or not, I don't really know, but it's probably going to be become a sort of ubiquitous requirement, I would think, in that way. I'm interested in Chris's ideas about, what's described as smart tourism techniques. I'm not entirely sure what smart tourism techniques are, but if what you mean by that, Chris, is opportunities to tell stories and provide information and insight and that sort of thing in new and different ways, whether you're on one of the tracks or wherever you might be, then I think that is interesting, and I think that could add value, because we know that engaging audience and helping them understand the stories of a place is part of how they feel part of a community, and perhaps technology can play a part in that.
Thank you, John. And I'm going to need to wrap it up now. So apologies if we didn't get to the last a couple of questions. We will share those with the speakers, but I'd like to thank Kathleen Scherf, Leon Gorovich and John Allen for really stimulating discussion reflective on creative places and creative tourism in small communities. On behalf of the university, thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Our next webinar is not until November. It's going to be about extended reality, and we'll use our usual mailing list to get that information out. But in the meantime, thank you again to our speakers. Have a look at Kathleen's book. Let's look forward to the next book. And thank you, everyone. Kia ora koutou.